What we're doing here is one of the crazy ideas I sometimes get on the weekend when I actually trying to relax a little bit and not think about work, which usually doesn't really work. Well, this series came up on a Saturday morning when I was sitting down with a coffee and thought it would be great if I would just create a lot of tracking plans covering all the different kind of tools that we all use every day, because this might give people an idea how to actually create good tracking plans, because it's easy for them to see the application, then on the other hand see the tracking schema. And when you know me, my emphasis will be on that you actually don't need that many tracking events to really understand how the product is working. This was part one. Part two was I figured out that when you take my book that I've been writing for 1.5 years, you can already buy it. I'm just finishing out the final chapter on documentation right now, but it already has 550 pages. So if you read the whole book, you understand how I approach tracking design. I'm using a framework that I have developed over time, which has this very fancy name, double three-layer framework. We will see it in practice in this video. The intention of this framework is really like to focus on the essentials. Don't overspend in implementations. Don't drive your developers crazy with implementations. This is the baseline. The second thought that brought me up with this kind of series was that I was talking to someone who was using my book in one of the Gen AI models and was chatting with it. And so by that, trying to understand different kind of principles. And so I thought, okay, maybe I can take it a step further. I took my book, prepared it, put it into Claude, and then ask it to create a tracking plan for me for a specific other project that I'm currently working on. And then it generated the tracking plan, and I was like, oh my God, this is already pretty close to how I would design the things if I would have started out from scratch. Turns out that the stuff that I put in the book works good enough that a Gen AI model can understand it, and based on that, create a tracking plan almost as I would have created a tracking plan. This might be interesting for you as well, but obviously, the whole thing only makes sense and it's only fun when we do a proper demo of it. And this is what the whole series is about. This is the first video. There are 20 more to come. I'm doing this for 4 weeks. Every morning, I will record a session where I create a tracking plan for a specific kind of tool. And today, we are creating a tracking plan for Notion. So this will be a fun experience because Notion has been growing a lot over the years. And so my plan is not to have a tracking plan or event data design that covers all the different kind of features in a lot of depth. This would be a really long video to discuss the back and forth, how you really balance this if you really have this very big app. Maybe I do this in the future as well. Here it's more, so look, if you have any kind of product that has some similarities with Notion, you have a workspace, people can create documents, they can do stuff in the documents, they can share stuff, they can invite other people. If you have these kind of mechanics, then this video is quite interesting for you, because the tracking plan that I am planning to create will cover this kind of basics. And this is always the best part to start. You always start with the fundamentals of your product, and then you can still become more complicated. But you should have a fundamental that is not too complicated. Without further ado, this is a practical hands-on video, so let's be practical. I will head over to Claude and I will quickly explain the setup, and then we create the first version of the tracking plan. And then we work back and forth with this tracking plan to see how we can maybe tweak it a little bit, how we can make it better. How I set everything up for me in Claude is I'm using a project. Project is a really nice thing in Claude where in the end so if you always work with the same kind of documents and context, so project is really nice because like you can add the documents here as context, which I did here. This is basically the PDF of my book in a minified version. Claude doesn't accept, I think my book now is 120 megabytes because it has a lot of illustration and so on in it. This wouldn't work. This you cannot get in here, but you can get a 30 megabyte version in there. When I send out my next version of my book, which will most likely already happen today, or at least in some days, so I will include a mini version as well that you can just then use in any kind of GI model. This is what I did before. I created a minified version. I added it here as context. And so with this context, I can now just always prompt. I can always now write my prompts without adding my book additionally here as an additional upload. So this makes it really straightforward for me. And so let's start to write a prompt. So I have a quick template here prepared. The template will also be in the descriptions. Okay, let's work on this. We want to create a tracking plan for Notion, a collaboration workspace. Okay, this is like the introduction. It might be also like, because like I would say from context, it already knows what Notion is. But obviously, if you have your product, you might need to get a little bit more, let's say, context in there. Just describe what your product is about. And so now we can add some stuff that users can do in this. This is already framing what kind of things we actually want to track. We're giving in some use cases or jobs to be done that people can do in the product. Obviously, with this, we are framing for what we want to create the tracking plan about. Okay, let's quickly get through what I just wrote here. I just give different kind of scenarios, what people can do. I wrote here on this pages, users can add text, images, chart, tables, and databases. They can share pages, workspaces with other users. They can create a team, invite team members. They can create an account and a subscription. They can create a subscription to unlock more pages and more content to add. I could go on more. Let's say if I have some other things where I think, okay, this could be interesting. Okay, maybe one thing which is important in Notion, users can link pages between each other to make navigation. I think that this is a good starting point. Again, we are talking about a design process. The design process starts somewhere. So this is how I usually, when I work on a tracking plan design, I start with the first draft. Obviously, before I do this, usually I do interviews. So I sit down with the company, and this is what we actually do, like the result here that I put in the prompt. So I'm really looking into what are different kind of user journeys look like, what are use cases look like, what are jobs to be done look like, so that I get a good idea what are actually the core things that this product provides to users and what kind of value they can get out of it. This would be an interesting experiment that I might do in a future video, to really just focus here to highlight the value moments, which I don't do here. Here it's pretty agnostic and doesn't really has an emphasis on where you actually can get value out of Notion. But this might be something for the future. Okay, then I give a little bit of instructions, what I want to have. So I say, okay, I want to have all the product entity defined. This is part of my framework that first of all, I have 3 layers, how I design events. So these are like product events, customer events, and interaction events. And I usually always start out with the product events because this is actually the foundation. This is the backbone of everything else. And I break down the product events into entities, activities, and properties. So the first test that I ran, I just add the upper part here, and then it still already broke down everything into product entities, activities, and properties, but it didn't do it consistently. I'm fine-tuning a little bit with the prompts to get the output as consistent as possible. I say, yeah, I want to have activities, properties, then I also want to have the customer layer, and I also want to have the interaction layer. So I want to have all parts of the double 3-layer framework, which in the end, yeah, I just want to have all parts of my framework. And so I give also a little bit more instructions, define core properties, and then list all activities with description, trigger conditions, source system, implementation status, and related metrics. This is all things that are later really important for the tracking plan documentation, where you want to add as much context as possible. All right, so let's give it a go. Excellent. Now let's work with it. First of all, so we are first looking at the product layer, which I asked for, which is good. We have a workspace entity. Maybe let's look first at the entities. We have a workspace entity, totally makes sense. Then we have a page entity, also totally makes sense. These are the building blocks that you need in Notion, and I always like to build my entities around building blocks. Then we have an account entity, which also makes sense because account is a very important entity. Then we have the team entity, and then we have the block entity. That's interesting. But one thing that I'm immediately missing, so this might be one of the critique, but let's see, maybe it has included in a different way, is the subscription entity. Subscription entity is not really like product related, it's more like already business related, but obviously this is the bridge between product and revenue. It's still a very important entity. Let's see, maybe it handled it differently. Let's start out with the product entity. It has different kind of activities. It has created, makes sense. It has updated. Again, updated is something, updated is always like my big and quick question mark activity. Sometimes it's valuable. Sometimes some updates to some entity give you some insights about how people get value from the product. For example, you can have a mobile app, and in this mobile app, sharing or giving specific kind of permissions to the mobile app is essential for a good user experience. Then obviously you update your account potentially, with the new permissions. This is an important update. This, for example, would always be where I would include something like account updated, and then I would have a property that tells me, okay, which kind of properties like these permissions have been updated. In our case, I keep it in the generation now, because like now then I would have back and forth with, hey, please remove this. I might just remove it later on, because updated, if a workspace is updated, it gives you a new name and so on. Obviously, when it's shared, so we haven't shared in here. This is, for example, something that we should now add as another one. Obviously, if it's shared, then it's important, but shared is not really updated. I would get away with updated. And so deleted is good. Again, this is like the thing that I always explain is when I look at an entity and the activities within an entity, I always try to map some kind of life cycle of this entity. And so we have the perfect life cycle here. Created, updated, deleted is the very normal perfect life cycle that you have within an entity. Obviously, what is missing for me is like shared. I can share a workspace with other people. I can share it publicly. I can invite people with their email addresses. And so this is something that we need to add. I will put in my feedback here in a second. Then we have some properties. ID, name, type, members count. Here we are talking about calculated properties, which can be super helpful, but you always have to see how you implement them. I would always work with this because I look to really compare workspaces with number of members or number of pages. This is really an interesting insight when you do analysis later, because you can really see, okay, for example, if let's say very big workspaces are very active as well. So you can create this assumption, then you can check it, but you need this kind of data for it. But you always have to check with your developers how you calculate everything like this. Because since they have been calculated, I can always recommend to pre-calculate them or like somewhere on the server before you send it up to the front end. And then if you want to calculate the whole stuff on the fly, usually people are not so happy. Like users not so happy because it's slow. Developers definitely not happy. So find a good way how you can calculate these things. Okay, that looks quite good. Maybe already get some add some feedback. Okay, page entity. A page can be created, then it can be updated. Again, does updated make sense? Potentially, yes. Because at least this could also be a point for a workspace. We could, for example, use the updated as a kind of heartbeat event to see if this thing is still going on. This might be interesting. Keep the workspace updated in there because this might be interesting. Let's keep it in there because it could be, for example, we could trigger it, it could be a calculated activity. Obviously, there are activities where you can track. This is usually like you have an action, like someone clicks on, hey, I create a page, then obviously the result of this action is like we sent an event like page created. But you could also have calculated activities which are, let's say, the result of other activities. For example, page updated could be a calculated activity which is triggered whenever people are adding new things to a page, a new blog, something else. But then we still have page updated as a high-level indicator that we can then use in any kind of analysis and dashboard to just indicate, okay, how many pages we can say, okay, look, we have 1 million pages and 10 of them were active in the last days. By this, we can have a page activity rate, which might be useful. I don't know, but it's definitely an interesting insight. I keep this in, even when I usually always challenge updated, but here, so then obviously, for example, the source would be different. Maybe this is something we can add, and we do the same for the page entity. One thing is, because I'm typing this right now, because it's in the end, it's not so disruptive for me, I often use this feedback session and I record voice for it. I use Super Whisper to, in the end, go through all the document and then just ramble my feedback into this. And the nice thing with Super Whisper, first of all, it makes a transcript of what I was speaking of, but then also it starts to condense it a little bit. So it removes duplication, it removes my pauses in between. And then I get just the feedback here that I can put into the text box. This is a lot faster. All right, let's quickly go on with the page. Duplicate is an interesting one. I definitely like this. Here, for example, again, we are talking about design. We can make decisions how we do things. There's no right or wrong. With duplicated is, okay, we add a new activity. And I always have the one big rule is like when you add an activity, you should have a good case for it. And this would be like the question here. Do we have a good enough case to actually add duplicated? Because we could also have an information about duplicated in the created event. So page created from other page, and then we could just have a Boolean on this, true and false. This would be the same like this kind of event. And I definitely have the tendency to do this here. I don't see a strong enough case that I would say duplicated is something that is so important to us that it becomes an event. When Notion has this initiative that they say, look, we do a lot of original, let's say, page templates, and we want to enforce people to create a copy of it, then it could make the case to actually have a duplicated event. This, again, we're talking about design. If this stuff is important enough that it deserves an own event, it deserves an own event. It's the same with entities. Does something deserve to be an entity? It is always like you have this very qualification level. You have to be really standalone to be an entity. So you also have to be really important to become an activity. If not, you just be a property. It's unfortunately you have to level up if you want to become important. But this is important because like with this you keep a good structure. You be very restrictive with events, you are very restrictive with entities, you are very restrictive with activities, and you're okay with properties. This usually is the kind of tracking setup that works best, at least in my experience. Just let me quickly look how it defines the property. Oh, okay, nice. It also prefixes everything with page, which I also usually do, and also I recommended it. And add a property, which is page. Okay, good. Then we have shared. Here we have shared, which is good. That's an important asset. Okay, let's quickly look into the properties. We also, if you just have one property, always have a page ID. Always have an identifier for everything. This is like one rule that you can just keep in mind. Whatever kind of entity you create, you always need a unique identifier. It helps you a lot. If you want to stitch up data later on, if you pull the data in a, let's say, out of your analytics system and you want to combine it with something else, so make sure that you have the ID in your analytics data, because then you can unlock this huge enrichment that you can get from the application database because you have the same IDs. Therefore, really important. Okay, page type doc database makes sense. As far as I understand Notion, you can have these two things. Again, we have some calculated metrics, which I really like. Blocks count, interesting to really see how many content blocks do we have. Then the interesting thing is how well you can track this and identify this. This is a talk that you should have with the development, if this is even possible. Shared count. It's also interesting. Oh no, this is actually really interesting. I wouldn't have thought of it initially, but I like the idea. We can use the page shared event to then calculate the whole thing, and then we can just attach it as a property value to make analysis interesting. For example, to identify. So we could then even create a nice dashboard where we have, let's say, different clusters of pages based on activity and based on, let's say, virality, like how much is shared. That's really interesting. Last modification is also interesting because like it helps us in the analysis to really, again, create these buckets of pages never been touched for ages, have been touched a while ago, and then just recently been active in this. This is definitely interesting. For example, page last modified could be also a case that we say, okay, we get rid of updated again. Again, like we're talking about design. When you say, I'm not really sure about this updated thing, but I really like the idea to get something like of an activity score, or let's say the possibility to analyze activity, you could get rid of updated and can just work with the last modified one. The last modified one should already cover a lot of things. Okay, cool. All right, let's talk about account entity. Again, we have created. Again, I think here I would definitely get rid of account updated, because account updated here doesn't really make sense. It has now an activity called subscription change. And this could be a valid thing. I usually have the tendency to have the subscription as its own entity, because subscription is really important. But technically, you can always cover it in account. For example, you could just cover it with this one activity, which is subscription changed, because this could cover everything. No, not everything. At least it could cover start, it could cover cancel. If you're just interested in these both, this could, for example, be something. It doesn't really cover retained. I will add how I usually handle subscription in a minute to it, but let's first go through everything else here. Okay, we have account ID. Yeah, all makes sense. Then we have the team entity, which also is good. It's quite important. Okay, we have created, member added. That's great. Team ID, team size, workspace. Okay, all makes sense. Here, for example, we could add another property of, let's say, member status, team member status. And then there we could put in invited and then confirmed. And so that member added has basically two states where we move through, or we introduce another activity like member invited and member added. Comes a little bit down how important this invitation thing is, but usually it's quite important. And now finally on the blog entities, we have created, updated, removed. We should definitely have something like deleted here again, blog add deleted activity. It's not really so important, but still it gives us some kind of, let's say, insight into patterns. Yeah, so this is good, block type. Again, this is something I really would have to check on a technical side if you could really do something like this in Notion. Obviously, you can add these blocks, but it's not clear if it's always like a clear block. You can just write stuff, and I don't know if this is really like a block or not. But it might be still interesting because you can definitely add some items to it. Maybe then block is the wrong. Again, we are talking now about language. At Notion, this might never be called a block. So they might call it an asset and an embed or whatever. I don't know. You always have to match it with the language that you use internally. So the tracking plan should always represent how you actually speak about your product in your company. So don't invent new terms in a tracking plan because you just think, oh, I don't like this other one. If people don't understand, they will not use it. So always make sure this. Okay, yeah, so we should add the deleted activity. Everything else looks fine for the first draft. And so then I want to add the subscription entity. Please add a subscription. I'm now adding like, can you please add a subscription entity with created, renewed, canceled, and ended activities. This is the small version. Let's say it's the middle version. Small version would be like created and canceled or created and ended. Let's say the middle version is what I have here with created, renewed, canceled, and ended. The more extended one would take into account if people upgrade or downgrade. If this is happening a lot, obviously, then these events are super helpful to have in there as well. Also, like another thing that you sometimes can do is resurrect it or reactivate it, especially like when you have the case that people often stop subscriptions, but they still come back after some time. Then this special events also make really sense. Okay, let's have a quick look on the customer layer. So the customer layer usually like it sits on top of the product layer and it describes more how the general customer journey looks like. Where like on the product layer, we look on also like on a higher level, how people are actually getting value out of the product and how they basically do basic actions in the product without going on interact. We're not interested in interactions. We're coming to interactions in a second. The customer layer is even an abstract higher. It's more through which states or stages a customer moves along their customer lifetime. And it has it really nicely here. So it has here the first one, first value moment. We could also, let's say the first one is actually a new user when they just start out for the first time, but it's fine. Not really necessary, but first value is definitely good. We have a first value moment, then we can construct it by, okay, someone created a first workspace, created at least 3 pages, and added at least 10 blocks, indicated intentional product adoption. That's a good starting point. When you design these customer events, or it's a definition of stage, because what you often also have, which is not present here, is you often have a time period attached to it. Here you would say first value moment would be, so you would maybe within 30 days. All these conditions that are described here within 30 days. Because you can assume that when someone hasn't done this after 30 days, you actually lost them. And so you want to identify how many people do we lose after we have new users, which we can then create based on account created or based on workspace created when they can create a workspace without an account. And then how many do we get from this to first value? And this is a nice conversion rate. It's an extremely helpful conversion rate because it tells us something about how well have we designed the getting to the first value experience, which could be an onboarding, which can be anything. You can have different kind of activities here. So that's a good one. Became active user, created content in 3 different days within the first week, or shared content with at least 2 people. Users show meaningful engagement. Yeah, it's a good starting point. Again, these are starting points. You have to validate them with the data. It might be that the definition is too broad, so you get too many people in there. It might be that it's too narrow, so you get few people in there. It might be that the narrow one is actually right, and you just don't do a good job yet. So you have to balance that. So you have to really figure out, so you have to talk to these people. You have to talk, okay, do you actually get it when you recognize, okay, no, people actually really get the value, but right now you don't measure, so you have to ask them, okay, what is valuable for you? Or at least you have to get to the point that they tell you something where you can deduct that is valuable for you, because people usually won't tell you something like this. And then you have to define the parameters and you have to fine tune them. All this, what we do here, needs fine tuning. You usually are not right by default. With some experience, you usually make some good definitions, some first good definitions, but you still, the fine tuning is built in. But you have to start with something. And I think like this, these are good starting points. Power user achieved, created 5 pages with 50 blocks each, or 3 active team members. For example, like here, active user and power user, this could be interesting to have 2 groups. And here, I would always time bucket them. I would always say, okay, let's assume Notion really takes the activity on a weekly basis. We could really look back on a week. We could say, okay, if people did this stuff in the last week, they are still active. If people did this much in the last week, they are power users. Then we can define criteria when they lose this status. If we do it in a very simple way, is okay, when they haven't done this, they are not power users anymore. They have to creating to be power users, which could be a first fine model. You can do more crazy stuff if you really want to go more complicated, so that once you are a power user, you stay longer a power user. You can have a different kind of definition for it. But you should always include a time period, because you need to see how people are transitioning between that. Because they can also be an at-risk user or at-risk customer, which means they have been a power or an active user before, but they haven't been active in the last, here, for example, it says, in the last 14 days. This segment is super important because it gives you the opportunity to reach out to these people. By email, surveys, you can reach out directly, you can ask them, hey, what's up? You always want to have this thing. Usually I also include, but I would start with that. Some extensions what you can use, so you can even then introduce something like dormant user. Dormant user are the ones that even go beyond at risk, so they really fade out. They were active at some point, but they don't do anything anymore, and so dormant users are actually lost. Then, for example, you could also create conversion rates between these different states. You want to see how many power users became at-risk users. And this is the metric that you want to monitor along the time. You really want to see, are we actually improving this? Are we actually, let's say we have a 20% of power users becoming at-risk users right now, and you can work on this. You can really say, okay, I want to keep the people in power users. And then you can work on this conversion rate. This is an interesting exercise because this is real interesting. I think the customer events for me this is really the intersection where deep product work and product analytics can come together. Because what we're just talking about, this is a deep product understanding, how you think that people should be in different states in your product. And so in here, we make it visible with data. And so this really unlocks magic, I can tell you. Okay, quickly about the interaction layer. The interaction layer is this fallback layer for all the different kind of events that are actually not important enough to make it into the product layer, but might be still important enough that someone at some point of time will ask you, hey, how many people clicked in the navigation on these kind of items? And so for this, I have the interaction layer. The interaction layer, as you can see here, is catch-all. Usually I have something like element clicked, and then I give all the context here in the properties, like element type. For example, it could be a menu item. And then like target, where does it go through? It could also like container or parent, so where is it? Position, so you could even add text, color, and so on. You could add as much context as possible. These kind of events even can be implemented automatically. I worked with development teams where we just made sure that on all the different kind of, let's say, in a sidebar, everything is always tracked automatically, and it always follows this kind of pattern. Even when they introduce new navigation items or they change the navigation at some point, the tracking just stays the same because like we pull all the context out and put it in the properties. The nice thing about this is we just have one event. The element viewed, for example, would be something that I would skip because like it creates a lot of noise, and I'm not really sure if it's really helpful, but it could be. So there might be scenarios where element viewed might make sense. But element clicked then becomes basically the big bucket of very generic events, which is just one event in your analytics tool or just one event table in your data warehouse. But if someone comes around and says, look, we really need to know how many people are clicking on this button in the top nav because we really want to analyze if this button actually makes sense, you can pull up an analysis because with, let's say, the context that you put into the properties, you can identify the clicks on this kind of element and you can just run this one-time analysis. The tricky thing is that most tracking plans are designed on interactions. I won't go this full into this because it makes the video too long. What you could see here is I designed tracking plans on a much higher abstraction level, and it makes it much easier because it goes back to the core things, how product works, and the core things, how business works. Where people click often doesn't really tell you anything about what kind of value they get out of the product, what kind of business value you get out of this click. It just tells you where people click. That's the only thing. But sometimes there's a scenario where it's interesting where people click. And so therefore I have the interaction layer, and I usually have 1 or 2 events in here, and I work everything with properties. And I'm always trying to get this implemented in some automatic way. That, let's say you have an event listener on all these different kind of things, and you give the structure, and it's implement once, and it doesn't have to be touched. Because implementing single interaction events, for developers, it's hell. All right, this really looks good. Let me just add the feedback here. So then I will get a new version. Okay, cool. Now it made the update. I'm cut it off here. Sometimes I do this for half an hour back and forth. It's still a very quick process. To create all these things is usually something that I do within 1 or 2 days. There I create a new draft. There's a lot of back and forth thinking about, okay, what should you put there? This speeds it up significantly. And there's also like a different way of working. I get a first result, I can tweak it, then I can think about it. Okay, I like it that it also proposes me things that I wouldn't maybe have thought about it. This is usually the process that I also have with clients, or when I work with some collaborators on a project. Obviously, you also have a back and forth, but this is a nice thing what you can have here as well. Okay, what I will do now is, so now the result is good. So we have a tracking plan. The next thing is to make it easier for you to view. I will now visualize it on a Miro board. I will put a JSON schema into a GitHub repository. You don't have to do this. JSON schema is something like if you work with specific tracking systems, like with Snowplow SDKs or with other things, it's basically a contract. You can define, okay, like the event schema should look like this. I always like to have it because then I can also run some tests on it. And I just do it here because I want to show you how I usually work with the stuff. So everything from here now is optional. This is your tracking plan. You can put it in a spreadsheet or on a Miro board. I will put it now on a Miro board. Then I will create the schema and also create documentation out of it. Let's maybe quickly check the documentation, how we can create it, because we can create it here as well. When we say, okay, this already looks nice, we want to already have a document that you can also potentially share with the developers. So let's quickly do that. Okay, now I give some instructions. I want to get a tracking documentation that documents everything that we have generated so far. I want to get as much context information here. I'm looking for event name, description, trigger, sources, implementation status used by this metrics. Let me structure this in a different way. Okay, let's quickly go through what I'm asking here. I want to have a tracking documentation with everything that we have generated so far. I want to have event name, description, trigger, sources, implementation status used by this metrics. I also want to see how it's implemented with the data layer. Obviously, you can replace this with the tool that you're using. Be careful with that. Sometimes the model makes things up. I, at least often enough, come across, let's say, some amplitude code that wouldn't work. Always cross-check this. You can improve the prompts by that. So like you can, for example, add an example. This is how a track event looks like. This is how identify event looks like, whatever you're using. Right now I'm saying data layer because I hope it understands data layer. Okay, and then I want to have the properties with name, type, and an example. Example is always very important, especially for properties. And then, I'm just saying, okay, I want to use this as documentation internally, but also as a handover for developers. So let's quickly create this. Okay, the data layer looks quite okay. We shouldn't call it Notion data layer. I usually just call it data layer. It's fine. This is just this is fine. We could correct. I keep it like this, but I might fix it once I copy it over. This is great. Now we have all the documentation ready here. So this is something here. It always likes to do something like this, like these tables here. But if you copy it over, usually like it's Markdown. So Markdown you can add everywhere, Confluence, any kind of wiki or so. This doesn't really work well, at least like how it formats it in a wiki. So, I mean, there are ways to format tables, so this usually don't work well. You usually have to ask, okay, can you please not do the properties as tables? But yeah, that's a good and solid. Also, like, I'm not really sure if you should add this validate event thing. That is a nice idea. We can discuss it with the developers if it makes sense or not. I always like it that it sometimes comes up with this nice additional ideas. Okay, cool. This is how you can create, Okay, let's now, I will switch off for a bit and I have some scripts, for example, that can transfer everything here now into JSON schema and into Miroboard. I quickly switch off. And when I'm back on, I'll quickly show you how this all looks like, and then we can close this whole thing. Okay, so I have some final stuff to show to you, and then you can then just check all the assets. I said, like, I will add the assets. You will find them in the description of the video if you watch this on YouTube. Then if you read in the blog post, obviously they are the same ones as too. You can always find it here in context, but let's say quickly on what I have created in the final instance. And also, especially like for the JSON or like for the JSON schema, I also used Claude to just generate this for this. So I just provide this as a template. Here I'm using the schema that Buzz is using. Buzz is, let's say, it's an event data collector, without going into any kind of details, but it's quite similar to the one that also Snowplow is using. So as you can see here, we define entity, we have activity. Here we define which kind of values the activity can has. So for example, here we still have to update this, like it's actually not, this should be deleted. And then we define all the different kind of properties that we can have, which kind of format. Also, like we add some enums if we just want to restrict the values that this can have. This is very technical. This is very nerdy. If you just create a tracking plan from a product perspective, you can just ignore everything we do here. And so I have a script that can automatically generate a mirror board out of it. And so then it does this. We now have, like here, we have the schema account entity. And now we have all the different kind of activities and we have all the different kind of properties. And I also add all the context that we have defined. So I add this here as well. Similarly to the properties, as you can see here. Usually when I do a handover, this is where I do the first handover. Then obviously you would put maybe your tracking plan in a spreadsheet or in Confluence or in any kind of different other tool. But this is already, if you want to start to discuss with people, like a Miro board is like a great place to do. At some point, I haven't have it ready yet, but at some point when, let's say my script is working, so I will put it in there, I will create another video so that you can, but let's wrap things up. What I wanted to show you is I wanted to give you a quick idea how I usually work with tracking plans. To do this in a very efficient way, I was using my own book where I wrote everything down like this, and I used the whole thing in Claude. And so then we basically formed a prompt to ask them, okay, can you please create a first draft of a tracking plan? And I hope you could see that the first draft is already quite good, but then obviously always needs a little bit of refinement. But it's really, I'm still quite fascinated what it can do. It could be an interesting thing. If you already have bought my book, so then you can already use the copies that you have. If not, feel free to do it. Also links that you can find. And then tomorrow comes the next one. We don't really have to wait so long. If you're just interested to watch me building and discussing tracking plans, you have a great 4 weeks in front of you. See you in the next video.